I saw my wife let her boss kiss her hand at the company couple's dinner, so I walked over to them, looked her in the eyes, and said, "This isn't where it ends, it's inside me." I left before the humiliation overwhelmed me completely. I didn't make a scene. I didn't scream. I didn't ask anything. I simply walked toward the door as if I had just buried something I loved more than life itself. What she didn't know that night was that the silence I carried with me was heavier than any words I could have said. The silence was mourning. The end didn't come with the kiss on my hand, nor with the evasive look she avoided giving me. The end came within me, minutes later, in the car, with the steering wheel between my hands and a bitter taste in my mouth, when I realized that such a small gesture, seemingly harmless, carried the weight of everything she had long been choosing behind my back. I was only the last to understand. It's strange to realize the exact moment love dies. It doesn't explode. It withers, silently. It turns off the light inside, as if to say, enough is enough. And in that instant, I knew that the story we had built, the sleepless nights, the impromptu trips, the plans for children and the future, had all become a memory she was willing to erase for a cowardly flirtation, for a touch that promised anything but truth. I spent days trying to find the guilt that didn't exist. I questioned myself, accused myself, looked for where I might have gone wrong. But nothing justified the disrespect of being replaced in front of me, at a dinner among colleagues, as if I were an annex to her life, not the main chapter. That wasn't just a betrayal of love. It was a betrayal of my presence. Of my loyalty. Of my daily effort to make her feel safe, loved, seen. The following week, when my soul had already fallen silent, I made it clear, our story ended there. She cried, of course. She tried to justify herself with clichés, empty arguments, words stitched together out of desperation and fear of being alone. She said it was just a moment, an impulse, that it had no meaning. But in that moment, I understood that the absence of meaning was precisely what hurt. It wasn't out of love for the other. It was out of disinterest in me. Out of neglect. And this form of betrayal is the cruelest, because it's not driven by passion, but by indifference. And when someone stops seeing who's by their side, love disintegrates silently. Time, that cold and silent judge, was relentless. She discovered for herself what it means to no longer have what you once had. He discovered that the boss who seemed so captivating only wanted her body for convenience. That he collected moments, not people. And she, who was once my life, became just another disposable piece in the game of someone who never promised anything, but let her believe everything. I, on the other hand, moved on. And I didn't move on out of anger, nor revenge. I moved on because I understood that love doesn't mean shrinking yourself to fit into someone else's world. I met someone. Someone who doesn't compare me, who doesn't make me doubt my worth, who chooses me loyally every day without me having to beg for it. It wasn't sudden. It wasn't easy. But with each sincere gesture, I was rebuilding myself. With each honest word, I was reassembling the parts of myself she had unknowingly broken. And one day, without warning, I realized it no longer hurt. That her memory no longer hurt me. That her name could be spoken without regret. Months later, she reappeared. Her eyes were emptier than before. Her voice trembled, begging for forgiveness. She said she'd made the worst mistake of her life. That she thought of me every day. That not a night went by without dreaming of our home, of our lazy Sundays, of the breakfasts I'd make for her for no reason. She said she saw everything clearly now. But there, in front of her, I felt only peace. A peace that never existed with her, because there were always doubts, demands, subtle comparisons. I didn't want that anymore. I was no longer the man she left. And she was no longer the woman I loved. I forgave. Not to get back. But to bring closure. Because those who carry a grudge are still tied. I wanted to let go. I did. But that didn't stop her from reaping the consequences. Because fate never fails. And time has a sense of justice that escapes our haste. And then the day came. The day the past knocked on the door, cruel and silent. We were at a party for a couple of mutual friends. I didn't know she would be there. Perhaps she didn't know I would be there either. But there we were. She arrived alone. I arrived with someone. And what happened in that room was the true end of our story. There were no shouts, no arguments. Just music playing in the background. A song that was once ours. The same song we danced to on our first trip together. The song that played when I proposed to her on the hotel terrace. And that night, in front of everyone, I danced with another woman. A woman who looks at me as if I were her home. Who smiles with her eyes. Who holds me as if she knows I'm everything she's always wanted. And it was in that moment, as I slowly spun with her around the room, that I noticed my ex-wife's lost gaze. She didn't blink. She didn't cry. She just watched, as if she finally understood. And there, without saying a word, she understood. That song was no longer ours. That love was no longer hers. And that man, no longer loved her. She felt what I felt that night at dinner. Only now, with no way out. Nowhere to run. She stayed there, trapped in her own absence. In her own regret. And I, for the first time, felt free. Because there is no greater revenge than genuine happiness after profound pain. And this was my revenge, rebuilding what she broke, without having to go back. But what she said to me at the end of the party, before she disappeared from my life for good, was what changed everything. And to this day, I wonder, whether she truly regretted it, or just realized she lost the one man who would have stayed forever. And what she revealed in that moment, no one would ever have imagined. Welcome to the channel where love is taken seriously and betrayal is never romanticized. Here, we do not support, and never will support, any kind of infidelity. The stories you'll hear are fictional, but carry deep emotional truths. Our purpose is clear: show how betrayal destroys, marks and changes people's lives forever. Prepare yourself for an intense, realistic, and emotionally devastating narrative. Take a deep breath. Because what you're about to hear, it's a shocking story. His name was Ethan. He had that kind of calm presence that seemed to effortlessly embrace a room. He wasn't a man of many words in public, but he had the rare talent for listening deeply, as if each sentence another person uttered was the most important thing he could hear at that moment. He was 36 years old, with a serene gaze and a restrained, almost shy, yet incredibly confident manner when he was with the one he loved. He was a financial analyst, methodical in his choices, but a secret dreamer. At the right moments, he would surprise her with gestures that didn't come from his pocket, but from observation, like remembering a movie she'd wanted to see for weeks, or cooking the dish she'd once mentioned without much thought. I had a habit of leaving short notes on the fridge before I left for work, just to ensure the good mornings lasted until late afternoon. He was the kind of man who didn't need to shout to be noticed, because the love he offered was made of constancy, not spectacle. Her name, on the other hand, was Olivia. She was brilliant, engaging, the kind of woman who seemed born to be on the move. She had an easy laugh and a natural magnetism that effortlessly made her the center of any room. A career publicist, creative and bold, she constructed ideas like someone painting invisible pictures in the air, always with sweeping gestures and sparkling eyes. She had ambition. Not in the cold sense of the word, but that burning desire to grow, to be seen, to carve out her place in a world that still insisted on limiting women. When she met Ethan, it was like finding the resting place she didn't know she was looking for. He brought balance, a kind of love that didn't seek competition, only addition. And she, who always felt she would need to mold herself to fit someone, felt for the first time that she could be whole. The beginning was enchanting. There was a calm chemistry between them, not explosive, but secure and full of small charms. Ethan was Olivia's foundation, and she was the open window that allowed him to breathe beyond the walls he had built himself. At home, he would make breakfast while she was still deciding which shoes would match her mood. At night, she would tell him office stories as if they were a play, and he would laugh as if he already knew all the endings but wanted to hear them again. They shared the tasks naturally, without much discussion, like someone who understands that love also lives in the everyday details. And in those details, the years passed almost without them noticing. They married after 3 years of dating. The ceremony was intimate, elegant, and simple, just like them. They didn't choose a grandiose party, but they made sure every face was present. It was a day of promises made with eyes before they were even spoken. Ethan swore to protect what they were building with more than care, with attention. Olivia promised never to let the rush of life take away what made them special. And in that moment, everyone in attendance believed they were witnessing something rare. And they were. For a long time, they were an example to their friends. Their relationship was a blend of lightness and commitment that seemed hard to find. There were no games, no power struggles. There was a partnership built on respect, admiration, and dedication. But time, even in the strongest relationships, tests invisible foundations. Olivia began growing professionally at a rapid pace. Her agency began competing for larger projects, more demanding clients, and high-profile campaigns. Ethan, always discreet, stuck to his steady routine, without fanfare, without ambitions for prominence, happy with the security he had achieved. It was a balance that worked, to a point. Gradually, her schedule became tighter. Business trips began to crop up more frequently. Meetings stretched beyond the hour. Saturday lunches gave way to team brainstorms. And yet, Ethan understood. Always understood. He saved dinner for her when she said she was going to be late. He texted her in the middle of the afternoon just to remind her to drink water. He never demanded, but he observed. With eyes that saw more than she imagined. Olivia wasn't pulling away out of ill intent, but out of distraction. Out of that kind of fatigue that seems harmless but is more consuming than any argument. She began to talk more about the company than about her own life. And in the few hours they had together, she brought her work to the table, to the couch, even to the bedroom. Ethan, patient as ever, didn't complain. He just asked if she was okay, if she needed anything, if she wanted to rest. Sometimes she became irritated by his care, not out of ingratitude, but because she felt pressured, even without him saying anything. It was a subtle, silent, but constant conflict. Ethan still loved her deeply. Olivia loved him too. But there was something between them that was beginning to change shape. Something no one named, but it was there, growing amidst the silences and involuntary absences. Ethan began to notice these gaps, but avoided confronting them. Not out of fear, but out of hope. He believed it was just a phase. That Olivia was going through an intense moment and that they would soon be back on track. He planned a surprise trip, just the two of them, to try to reconnect with what he felt was slowly slipping away. She thanked him, smiled, and said it was a beautiful idea, but unfortunately, she had an agency event that same week. He smiled back. He said he understood. And indeed, he did. But that night, when she went to sleep, he lay awake for hours, lying beside her, staring at the ceiling, trying to remember the last time she looked at him with that glow that used to light up her eyes just seeing him walk through the door. Things weren't bad. There were no fights, no betrayals, no lies, no disrespect. But there was also no longer the same lightness. The love was there, but it felt tired. Olivia tried to compensate with small gestures, bringing him his favorite dessert, sending him affectionate text messages in the middle of the day, kissing him before leaving, even when she was late. Ethan appreciated each of these attempts. But something inside him had already begun to suspect that perhaps the problem wasn't a lack of love, but a lack of presence. And presence, for him, has always been the greatest form of love. Then an invitation arrived. A company dinner, something formal, elegant, with all the high-ranking figures gathered. Olivia insisted Ethan attend. She wanted him to better understand the environment she now lived in, the people she spent so much time with. He hesitated at first, not exactly comfortable with this kind of occasion, but he relented. He did it for her. He bought a new suit. He shaved more carefully. He applied the perfume she always said she loved. He didn't say it, but he wanted her to look at him that night and remember who they were building together, even without saying anything. In the car on the way to the event, they exchanged few words. Olivia was busy with last-minute messages, checking event details. Ethan, in the seat next to them, simply watched the city pass by the window. He thought about how important this moment would be. How perhaps this dinner would be a turning point. An opportunity to reconnect. To reclaim what seemed to be slipping away amidst the hustle and bustle of life. The room was elegantly lit. Olivia was greeted enthusiastically, with hugs and greetings. Ethan felt slightly out of place, but he tried to blend in, chatting politely with her colleagues. He observed everything attentively, but his focus was on her. Always on her. And in that sophisticated setting, amidst glasses of wine, corporate speeches, and loud laughter, Ethan saw something. Something that, at that moment, he still didn't know exactly how to interpret. But something that would begin to silently transform everything he felt. A detail. A gesture. A look. But that was yet to come. The dinner seemed like any other event, but there was something different about that night that Ethan couldn't immediately identify. The room was spacious, the lights reflected off the crystal glasses, and the air carried that mingled scent of wine and expensive perfume that often heralded formal occasions. Olivia moved between the tables with ease, greeting colleagues, exchanging laughs, part of a world that seemed increasingly distant from the one they'd shared at home. He watched her from afar, admiring her confidence, the natural way she seemed to dominate every room she entered. It was beautiful to see her like this, but also painful. Ethan sensed that her glow was accompanied by a kind of absence, as if her gaze, even when meeting his, didn't fully see him. During dinner, they exchanged few words. Olivia was constantly being called upon, interrupted by colleagues, praised for the new project she'd spearheaded. Ethan smiled, trying to stay present, but he felt invisible. Constantly, she seemed surrounded by an energy that didn't include him. And then, in the midst of their conversations, he noticed a man approaching her with subtle familiarity. A brief touch on the shoulder, an overconfident smile, the kind of gesture only those who are intimate with someone allow themselves. Ethan watched without reacting, trying to rationalize what he saw. The man was charming, speaking softly in her ear, and she was laughing. It wasn't the usual kind of laughter, it was a nervous, controlled laugh, as if trying to appear natural. It awakened something in Ethan, not anger, but a deep unease, a silent warning that something wasn't right. After the event, in the car, the silence between them weighed almost physically. Olivia commented on the success of the evening, on how well everything went, but avoided talking about the colleague who had stayed too long by her side. Ethan, still confused, simply nodded. He knew jealousy could be unfair, he knew he had no right to question without proof, but intuition, that force that had so often guided him well, began to pulse in a way impossible to ignore. The following days passed in a blur. Olivia seemed more absent, more distracted. She claimed to be overwhelmed with a new project, arriving late, exhausted, and often not hungry. Ethan remained attentive, but something inside him had changed. He began to notice details that had previously gone unnoticed, her new attention to perfume, her cell phone that now always remained face down, her different smile when reading messages. At night, she fell asleep before him, and he lay there, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sound of his heartbeat. The trust that had always been his safe haven now trembled. One night, when Olivia left for what she called an emergency meeting, Ethan stood at the living room window, watching the street reflect in the glass. A light rain fell as if washing away the silence. He wondered when things had started to drift apart. He remembered the times when she would return eager to share the news, when he was the first to know everything. Now, he was the last. The love still existed, but it was wounded, unsure of where to lean on. He didn't want to believe anything was wrong, but deep inside, he was beginning to understand. Weekends, once full of plans, became a space of waiting. Ethan made coffee, tidied the house, turned on her favorite music, but the empty couch seemed to mock his attempts. Olivia said she was tired, said she needed time for herself, and he respected that. She tried not to show her growing fear, but her body betrayed it, the slower way she glanced at the clock, the cold coffee forgotten in the cup, the lost look in her eyes when she walked through the door, her former glow gone. Still, he loved her, and love, for him, had always been synonymous with patience. One day, Olivia arrived later than usual. Ethan was in the kitchen, finishing putting away the dishes, when he heard the key in the door. She came in, her perfume intense, her smile tired. He reached out to hug her, but she subtly moved away, claiming she was sweaty and needed a shower. The gesture was small, but it resonated deeply within Ethan. It was the kind of separation you can't explain, you just feel. He stood there, watching her climb the stairs. Something inside him shattered, though he still didn't know why. In the days that followed, he tried to convince himself it was just a phase. He collected signs, but also excuses. When she left her phone on the table, he'd look at it and fight the urge to pick it up. Not because he wanted to invade her privacy, but because the fear of discovering the truth paralyzed him. Still, a part of him already knew. He knew and kept quiet, like someone trying to keep their heart alive inside a bleeding body. One night, when he returned from work early, Ethan found the house plunged into silence. The living room lights were on, and Olivia's coat lay on the sofa. He called out to her, but there was no answer. He climbed the stairs slowly, hearing the distant sound of a muffled male voice. The world seemed to stop for a second. His body reacted before his thoughts. Each step to the bedroom door was a struggle between wanting to believe and knowing inescapably. When he opened the door, what he saw was more than a scene. It was confirmation that trust would not return. Olivia turned in fright, trying to cover her body, murmuring his name, but her voice came out shaky and broken. The man beside her stood, stunned, trying to formulate some impossible explanation. Ethan stood there, without screaming, without crying, without reacting. His silence was more cutting than any words. He stared at her for what felt like an eternity. And then he simply said that this wasn't where it ended. It was inside him. And he left. The house collapsed. Olivia tried to get dressed, run after him, justify herself, but the sound of the door closing was more final than any sentence. That night, he drove aimlessly. The city passed by in a blur, and he felt his heart pound with a mixture of despair and liberation. The pain was still fresh, but a new clarity was growing amidst the chaos. He understood, with brutal clarity, that nothing would ever be the same. There was no going back after seeing what he had seen. The following days were empty. Ethan packed a small suitcase, gathered some clothes, and left a simple note saying he needed some time. Olivia tried calling, texting, asking for forgiveness. But he didn't respond. Silence became her shield, her way of preserving what was left of herself. She, on the other hand, began to feel the weight of his absence. The emptiness of the house, the echo of his footsteps that never returned, the absence of the small kindnesses that once seemed eternal. Time passed. The words hung suspended, unfinished. Olivia tried to follow her routine, but everything seemed dull. Work no longer held the same spark. The nights were too long. In every corner of the house, there were traces of him, the subtle scent on the pillow, the books organized by color, the cups he loved. And the more time passed, the more she realized she had lost something that cannot be bought, repeated, or replaced. Ethan, for his part, withdrew into himself. He spent his days in silence, rebuilding his center, trying to understand where he had lost himself and why it still hurt so much. It wasn't the kind of pain that screams, it was the kind that eats away at him. A clean wound, but deep. He didn't want revenge, he didn't want drama. He just wanted peace. And peace seemed so far away. Weeks turned into months. The world seemed to have moved on, but within them, ruins still lay. Olivia began seeking him out, sending messages asking to talk, saying she needed to explain, that she regretted it. But he didn't respond. She knew nothing she could say would erase what she'd seen. The love that had once sustained them was now trapped in a time that would never return. And so, as she tried to rebuild a love she had unwittingly destroyed, he began to understand the meaning of starting over. But fate still had something in store for her that neither of them could have imagined. Something that would forever change the way she would view love, and how he would understand forgiveness. Something that was about to be revealed. The party wasn't grand, nor had he planned it. It was a simple affair, organized by mutual friends, with understated decor, low lighting, and ambient music. When he received the invitation, Ethan considered declining. He was no longer the type to frequent crowded places, where the laughter was always too loud and the reunions forced. But that week, something inside him was different. He no longer felt the weight on his shoulders as before. He slept better. He laughed lightly. He was back to cooking for two. And there was someone. Someone who had emerged gradually, with gentle gestures, without rushing time, just by being there. It was this presence that now made him want to leave the house. She insisted they go together. Ethan relented. And for the first time in a long time, he felt ready to expose himself again, without fear of comparisons, without fear of memories. They arrived discreetly, without fanfare. They greeted a few friends, laughed at the usual jokes, and grabbed a drink. The evening was light, until he felt an old weight settle in his stomach. It was as if his body had recognized it before his mind. And then he saw it. Across the room, amidst curious glances and awkward smiles, was Olivia. Alone. Wearing a pretty dress, but with eyes filled with absence. Time had changed something about her. Not in her face, but in the way she carried herself. Gone was the usual glow, the rush of gestures, the automatic laughter. There was only a restrained, almost resigned silence. Ethan looked away, gently squeezed the hand of the person next to him, and continued the conversation. But he knew. He knew that this night would not pass without a moment's notice. When the music began, his heart skipped a beat. It was an old melody, familiar, too intimate. The song that had once marked the beginning of a story. He hesitated. The woman beside him gently pulled him to dance. He accepted. And there, in the center of the room, with slow steps and eyes fixed on hers, he danced. There was no guilt. There was no provocation. There was only presence. And a calm surrender that contrasted with everything Olivia saw from the edge of the dance floor. She didn't blink. She didn't smile. She just watched. And in that instant, something inside her collapsed brutally. Reality struck with silent violence. The man who had once been her haven now found shelter in another's gaze. After the dance, Ethan sat for a few minutes apart, needing air. That's when Olivia approached. He saw her approaching slowly, as if asking permission with each step. She stopped in front of him and said nothing for a few seconds. Her teary eyes struggled to maintain some dignity. Finally, she asked if she could speak with him. Ethan agreed, half-heartedly. They got up and walked to a more private hallway in the house. The sounds of the party grew distant. The silence between them was different now. It wasn't tense. It was resolute. She began by apologizing. Not for what she had done, because she knew that could never be undone. But for the time it took to understand what she had lost. She said she had spent the last few months trying to understand herself, trying to find elsewhere what had only made sense with him. She said the colleague she had been involved with was no longer part of her life, that the relationship didn't last, and that, deep down, she always knew it would last. Ethan listened, silent. Not coldly, but lucidly. He no longer needed that story. He had already closed the chapter. But when she hesitated, as if something was yet to come, he stared, waiting. It was then that Olivia took a deep breath and revealed what she'd been keeping inside for months. It wasn't just about the betrayal. It wasn't just about the infidelity itself, but about what she'd done with it. She said that after that night, when Ethan left without looking back, she felt empty. She tried to fill that void in many ways: work, distractions, people. But nothing worked. And that's when she sought out the other man again. She wanted answers. She wanted to understand why she'd risked so much for so little. She went to him, told him she needed to talk, that maybe there was still something between them. He listened patiently, but in the end, he gave her a wry smile and told her she was confusing attention with affection. That he'd never promised anything. That he was just enjoying the moment. Olivia left, devastated. He sat in the car and cried for hours. Not because of the end, but because of the brutal clarity that there had never been a beginning. The next day, he reached out to his friends. He wanted support, a shoulder to cry on. But he received sidelong glances, cold advice, and questions that felt like judgment. And there, in that moment, he realized that his downfall wasn't just in love. It was in everything. He had lost the respect of those who admired him. The trust of those who loved him. The foundation from which he built himself. But what Ethan heard next was the real blow. Olivia revealed that soon after everything happened, she decided to tell someone the truth. She felt she deserved to be punished. He wanted someone other than himself to know. He called his mother. Yes, the woman who had once welcomed her as a daughter. He wanted to apologize. But she was met with silence. The voice on the other end simply said, "You broke him. And from this day forward, you are no longer part of our story." Olivia hung up without answering. It was the last time he tried to justify himself. Ethan remained silent. He was motionless. Every word seemed to confirm what he'd already felt but never truly known. It wasn't just the betrayal. It was what she'd done with the love he'd given her completely. It was the waste of something she'd only valued when it became a memory. And now, there, before him, she wept. Not seeking forgiveness. But like someone watching their own past burn in slow motion. She said she hadn't expected him to return. That she knew it was too late. But she needed to say it. She needed to free them both from that unfinished story. And then she asked one last thing, that he not hate her. That he at least keep the good memory of who she was before everything. Ethan took a deep breath. He ran a hand through his hair. He looked her in the eye firmly and told her he didn't hate her. That forgiveness had already happened, not for her, but for himself. That he did cherish the memories, good and bad, as part of who he was. But now, he was no longer that man. That she was part of a closed phase of his life. He said forgiveness wasn't about opening doors. It was about closing cycles. When Olivia turned her back and walked toward the exit, he didn't feel anger. He felt relief. This was the end she needed to experience. And the definitive beginning of what he was building. Because the love she discarded, another knew how to cherish. And nothing, absolutely nothing, was more fair than that. But there was still something Olivia didn't know. Something that would forever change the way she viewed what she lost. Something that was yet to come, and would be impossible to forget. When Olivia left that narrow, silent hallway of the house where the party was taking place, it wasn't just her body that walked, it was the weight of life she carried on her shoulders. Each step she took seemed to drag a broken version of herself along. She knew she would never see him the same way again. She knew that there, once and for all, ended all that remained of malformed hope within her. He didn't shout, he didn't humiliate her, he didn't raise his voice, and that undid her. Because deep down, it hurt so much more to see the man she'd betrayed find the peace she'd never known how to give. When she passed through the main room again, she pretended to smile at a friend, but her eyes were already red. The music continued to play, the people continued to dance, but inside her, there was silence. A kind of silence that screams. Ethan didn't return to the party. He left through the back door with the woman who now shared his life with serenity and affection. They walked together through the quieter streets of the neighborhood, unhurried, without conversation. She didn't ask anything, didn't demand explanations. She simply held his hand and walked beside him. It was this kind of presence that healed, not the one that asked questions, but the one that understood without words. On the way to the car, Ethan stopped once, looked up at the clear sky, took a deep breath, and simply said, "That was the last time I looked back." She simply nodded, lightly squeezing his fingers between hers. Life went on. Monday arrived like any other, but with a lighter air. Ethan returned to work with a clear head, as if he had reorganized every thought. Peace, now, was not an illusion he sought, but a reality built on firm decisions. The new woman by his side was not a substitute. It was a conscious choice, a different construction. They talked about everything, including the past. But there was a limit, they never returned to a place that already hurt too much. The present was more comfortable, more real. Their relationship was cemented by respect, mutual admiration, and that rare lightness born of truth. Meanwhile, Olivia sank into reflection. She spent more time alone, spoke less at work, and declined invitations. The world, which had once seemed to revolve around her achievements, was now an empty echo. That's when, one random late afternoon, she decided to do something unthinkable. She returned to the restaurant where she and Ethan usually dined on Fridays. She sat at the same table, ordered his favorite dish, and sat there for hours, fiddling with her napkin, watching people come and go. The waiter recognized her but said nothing. The background music played softly, and longing danced alone within her. For the first time, Olivia didn't try to justify anything internally. She didn't search for reasons, she didn't protect herself. She simply sat and felt. She felt everything she'd neglected, everything she'd wasted, everything she'd never have again. That was the day she began writing letters. Not to send, but to empty herself. She wrote to him, to herself, to time, to silence. And each page was an attempt to forgive herself, even though she knew that forgiveness might never come. 2 months later, the unexpected happened. Ethan received an invitation to give a talk in another city, about financial literacy and the emotional impact of financial decisions on marriage, something that combined his profession with personal experience, which, although he'd never shared publicly, he knew was imprinted on his worldview. The talk would be at a closed, private conference, but with participants from diverse fields. He decided to accept, more as a form of internal closure than as a career advancement. The trip was brief. He went alone. He needed this moment to himself. On the day of the talk, at the end of the event, after the questions, a woman approached him. She was a journalist in the audience and wanted to interview him for a project on emotional finance. Ethan hesitated, but agreed. They scheduled a meeting for the next day at the hotel cafe. What he didn't expect was that this conversation would change something. During the interview, they talked about choices, losses, and rebuilding. And then the journalist asked about forgiveness. Ethan was silent for a few seconds. Then he calmly replied, "Forgiveness isn't about giving someone else a second chance. It's about giving yourself a second chance." She smiled, wrote it down, and thanked him. But there was more to it than just a simple note. Ethan's response began to circulate discreetly on social media platforms linked to the event, as quote of the week. Someone screenshotted it, someone else shared it, and within days, the quote went viral. A psychology page shared it. An influencer commented. And soon, it was everywhere. Olivia saw the phrase one random afternoon, while distractedly scrolling through social media. As she read it, she froze. That was his voice. It was him, exposed in a few words, saying everything she hadn't had the courage to ask. The blow wasn't going viral. It was realizing that the man she destroyed had become a role model for others. And that now, he was helping people start over from the pain she'd caused. It was then that she knew he'd moved on in a way she could never achieve. The following days were a spiral of memories. Olivia tried to write more letters, but nothing made sense. He then decided he needed to see her again. Not to ask for anything. Not to get back together. Just to return something. He had kept an envelope all this time. Inside was an old letter Ethan had written on their 3rd wedding anniversary. She had never replied. At the time, she read it and cried, but she put it away in a drawer. Now, she felt that letter belonged to him again, or at least, to the end of their story. She got the address from a mutual friend. She went to his house with trembling hands, unsure if he would be there, unsure what he would say. She knocked on the door and waited. When Ethan appeared, he stared at her for a few seconds, silent. Olivia carefully held out the envelope and said, "This is yours. I kept it. But I no longer have a right to it." He took it, looked at it, recognized the handwriting, and replied firmly, "You did. But you chose not to answer." She nodded, without looking away. Before he closed the door, she said, "I didn't come to ask for anything. I just came to return what, one day, showed me what true love was." Ethan was silent for a moment longer, then said, "You're late even for this. But thank you." He closed the door gently. She left feeling lighter, but no less sad. And as she walked back to the car, something inside her finally understood, there are things that, once broken, can't be put back together. No matter how much you regret them. The pain of loss only has real meaning when there's no way to recover what was lost. And Olivia, who had spent her life seeking recognition, saw in Ethan's silence the cruelest recognition of all, that she was no longer needed. Later that night, Ethan opened the envelope and read his own letter. He felt a pang in his chest, not from longing, but from gratitude. Gratitude for having lived through it and having come out the other side whole. When he finished, he tore the letter into pieces and threw it away. It was the last part of a story that no longer needed to exist. Then he looked out the window, saw the woman he now shared his days with sitting in the garden, reading a book, and thought about how life has subtle ways of giving us back everything that was once taken from us. Not like before. But better. And this time, without the fear of being lost again. That night, after tearing up the letter and watching it slowly disappear into the ashes of the past, Ethan felt neither euphoria nor immediate relief. What washed over him was something much quieter, but equally profound, a complete acceptance of the path he had taken, with all its cuts, detours, and scars. It was as if, by physically saying goodbye to that last memory held by Olivia, he had finally closed all the windows through which the cold wind of remembrance still entered. There were no more questions. No more gaps to fill. Only the now. And in the now, he was no longer the wounded man who had seen his story ripped out by the roots, but someone who had learned to flourish in other soil, with other hands, under a more serene light. The next morning, he woke earlier than usual, sat on the edge of the bed, and spent a few minutes simply observing the room around him. Every detail of that new life seemed to say, "You've arrived." But even amidst the tranquility, there was a bittersweet feeling, an inner echo that made him reflect on how the human heart is, by nature, contradictory. Was it possible to be at peace and still feel a thread of sadness for everything that didn't work out? Yes. Because loving, even when you've stopped loving, always leaves a mark. And Ethan understood this with the maturity of someone who didn't seek to erase what they'd experienced, but to integrate it all into who they had become. Even though Olivia was now in another orbit of his life, the scar she had left was part of the cartography of his soul. And there was no shame in that. Quite the opposite. It was this trace that made him more aware, more whole. In the days that followed, he allowed himself short silences, long, aimless walks, afternoons lost in his own thoughts as he listened to the new woman beside him share something mundane about her day. And in every word, in every smile he received, there was an involuntary contrast with the past. But not a comparative contrast, but rather one of growth. He realized how much his capacity to love had matured, how much pain had taught him to be clearer, more truthful, more willing to protect himself without closing himself off. At the same time, he recognized in her something he'd never had before, a sense of presence. She wasn't a woman who needed to prove anything to the world, nor did she seek conquest as a form of escape. She was just that. Whole. And her being, as simple as it seemed, was the most revolutionary thing Ethan had ever experienced. Meanwhile, on the other side of the story, Olivia was experiencing a reverse process. Her home, once a scene of victories and excitement, was now a dwelling of long silences and involuntary reflections. She still worked, still went out when necessary, but her outlook had changed. There was a new weariness on her face, not physical, but emotional. A kind of exhaustion that comes when you realize that pride has been the greatest thief of your own happiness. She spent long periods sitting at the kitchen table, with a half-empty cup of coffee, remembering details she once considered insignificant, like the way Ethan observed the plants on the balcony, or the way he worried about adjusting the temperature of her shower on cold nights. Small things that in everyday life seemed trivial, but now emerged as silent witnesses to a genuine love she had failed to cultivate. On a gray afternoon, Olivia went to visit a childhood friend. He didn't talk about Ethan, nor about regret. He just listened. And for the first time, she realized how she had become a spectator in other people's lives. Before, she was the protagonist of everything, always at the forefront, always the center. Now, he listened more than he spoke. And in this place of listening, she discovered a new pain, that of having no one to share the simplest joys with. She realized it wasn't just the loss of her husband, but of companionship, of trust, of intimacy. She had also lost the right to be remembered fondly. And this kind of loss was the hardest. Because it's not seen. It's only felt. In the emptiness of conversations. In the absence of a hand that knows you. In the silence after an achievement with no one to celebrate. Ethan, for his part, continued to build his routine with firm steps. He began planning a move. Not because he wanted to erase his memories, but because he felt it was time to create new spaces with new meanings. Together, he and his partner began visiting properties, discussing possibilities, and thinking about what it would be like to build a home from scratch. And in the process, he discovered something unexpected: there was room to start over without fear. He didn't need to shield himself or carry the ghosts of the past. They were still there, but now they weren't haunting, they simply served as a reminder of what one didn't want to repeat. And that, in itself, was liberating. One Sunday afternoon, opening an old box of objects he hadn't seen in a long time, Ethan found a photo. It was of him and Olivia, smiling in a park. The day was bright. The image was beautiful, but it didn't cause pain. Just a quiet acknowledgement that, once upon a time, there had been love there. And that it didn't need to be denied for him to continue living. He held the photo for a few seconds, then put it back in the box and closed it. He was ready for the next chapter. Not because he had overcome everything, but because he had learned not to let what was left behind define what lay ahead. On the other side, Olivia made a silent decision. She decided to leave the city for a while. She accepted an invitation to work at another branch of the agency, in a quieter area. She wanted to start over, far from the places where memories surrounded her on all sides. Not to escape, but to rebuild. Before leaving, she sent one last message to Ethan. A short one. It simply said, "Thank you for loving me when I didn't yet know how to love anyone. I hope life rewards you twice as much." He read it, didn't reply. But he sincerely hoped she would find the peace he now held. And with that silent farewell, their paths diverged forever. There were no more bridges. Only different horizons. Ethan moved on to his new home, where he would build a home with new roots. Olivia left for a place where she could, perhaps, plant something with the seeds she had finally learned to care for. Neither of them was the same anymore. And deep down, that was the saddest and most beautiful part of it all. Because growing up, sometimes, means losing. And losing, often, means making room for what truly matters. The difference is that one of them understood this in time. The other, too late. Ethan no longer kept dates. He didn't need to. The things that had shaped his life were all within him, no longer on calendars. He didn't know exactly how much time had passed since he'd last seen Olivia, since the day she'd handed him the letter and disappeared into the rearview mirror of his life like a memory he'd finally accepted not to carry. The new house was in a more remote neighborhood, with ancient trees lining the street and a silence that could be heard even during the day. The walls still smelled of new paint, and the furniture was chosen slowly, unhurriedly. There was no rush in anything in his life now. It was as if, for the first time, I'd learned to breathe at the right pace. At first, living without noise felt strange. He was so used to walking with the tension of waiting for something to break that the absence of conflict felt like new ground beneath his feet. But there, in that new construction that was emerging between him and the woman who now shared his days, everything was simple. And it was in that simplicity that he found himself again. There was one night in particular that marked this silent transition. They were sitting on the living room floor, their wine glasses still full, laughing over a failed attempt to assemble a piece of furniture that looked like it had been designed by someone who hated screws. Amidst the mess, she looked at him with an undemanding gleam in her eyes and said softly, "You don't need to be afraid to be happy with me." He didn't respond immediately. He just stared at her for a few seconds and, without realizing it, began to laugh. A short, restrained laugh, but so genuine that she smiled along with it. That was it. There was no more fear. He no longer needed to protect himself from something that didn't exist. The past was no longer a ghost, it was just an old chapter. Meanwhile, in another corner of the country, Olivia was trying, for the first time, to do something without expecting applause. The new city didn't know her. Her colleagues barely knew where she came from, and that, in a way, was liberating. She could start over, not as the admired or desired woman, but as someone ordinary. In the early days, she avoided overly personal conversations. She limited herself to work, to the quiet cafes in the square near her new apartment, to solitary trips to the market. But over time, she began to open up in small doses. A teammate began accompanying her to the subway. An elderly neighbor began leaving notes with recipes on her doorstep. Life was beginning to forge new bonds. But she knew, they weren't replacements. They were bridges to herself. One autumn afternoon, while sorting through her emails, Olivia found a message she had completely forgotten. It was months old, sent to an old friend who had never responded. The message was raw. She confessed everything, the betrayal, the emptiness, the regret. She read it now with different eyes, as if observing herself from the outside. The woman in that message was different. Desperate, broken, blinded by a futile need to justify what had no justification. She closed her computer and, for the first time in a long time, cried without trying to console herself. She allowed herself to feel shame, pain, longing, but also something new, compassion for herself. For the woman who fell. For the woman who tried to change. For the woman who, despite her flaws, still had the strength to move forward. The following month, Olivia was invited to participate in a social project run by the agency. The idea was to help vulnerable young people understand the power of communication. She accepted without hesitation. She began attending public schools, talking to teenagers, and hearing real, hard, and raw stories. And when she found herself facing the pain of others, she found an unexpected way to forgive herself. Not as someone who absolves themselves of guilt, but as someone who understands that continuing to hate themselves doesn't change what they've been through. One day, after a lecture, a 15-year-old boy approached, his eyes downcast, and said, "My mother abandoned me. But I still think she can come back." Olivia didn't know what to say. She simply hugged him. And in that embrace, she felt something break inside her. For the first time, she no longer wanted to be forgiven by Ethan. She simply wanted to be useful to someone. And perhaps, in that desire, her silent redemption was being born. Meanwhile, Ethan was taking bigger steps forward in his own life. Invited to become a partner in a new consultancy, he accepted naturally. Not like before, when achievements were accompanied by fear or guilt. Now, everything felt lighter. The company was growing, the relationship remained stable, and the plans, previously stifled by trauma, were beginning to take shape. Little by little, he was thinking about marriage again. Not as an escape, but as a celebration of a mature choice. He spent more time with his family, reconnected with old friends, and reconnected with parts of himself he'd left behind. At an end-of-year gathering, an old acquaintance approached him and said, "You seem like a different man." Ethan smiled. "I'm the same. Only whole." And that phrase resonated within him for hours, like a mantra. Because that's exactly what it was. He hadn't become someone new. He'd simply recovered from the inside out. One day, during a quiet Saturday breakfast, as he watched the sun stream through the curtains of his new home, Ethan received an unexpected call. It was his mother. She asked if he could pick her up, she wanted to take him somewhere. Without giving many details, she hung up. He went. In the car, they made small talk until she pointed to an address on a tree-lined street. It was a small, new, discreet gallery. As they entered, they saw a few people examining simple but moving paintings. At the back, a separate section caught their attention. The exhibition was called, "What I Would Have Said If I Had Listened." Signed in the corner of each canvas were simply the initials OM. Ethan didn't react immediately. He simply walked through the works. They were phrases written on scraps of paper, pasted over faded images, portraits of ordinary moments, like a set table, a forgotten cup, an open suitcase. One read, "I betrayed you when I stopped looking at you." Another, "I thought it was freedom, but it was just ego." And then, before an image of a female shadow sitting on the edge of a bed, she found the last sentence, "The truest love I ever had didn't ask me to change. And I left anyway." There were no tears. No anger. Ethan stood there, motionless, for several minutes. Then he walked to the reception desk and asked about the artist. The woman simply smiled, "She doesn't participate in exhibitions. She said her art speaks for her." Ethan understood. He didn't need to see. He didn't need to speak. It was her way of closing a cycle. And he respected it. He returned home certain that now, even the loose ends were tied up. Their story was, finally, complete. Not because it ended well, but because it truly ended. And that, in the end, was all he needed. Time passed with the cutting delicacy of definitive changes. Cycles ended without grandiose announcements, but with the firmness of someone who understood that life waits for the indecisive. Ethan, now with a peace that no longer needed explaining, looked at his own reflection in the mirror with pride. Not for what he had achieved materially, but for the man he had managed to rescue within himself. He wasn't the same person who left that dinner years ago with his heart in ruins, and he didn't need to be. He now carried maturity, lucidity, and an integrity that withstood the deepest shocks. Alongside the one who chose him every day with sincerity, he experienced a relationship without gray areas, without demands hidden behind smiles, without empty spaces disguised as freedom. It was love with presence, with truth, with conscious choices. It wasn't perfect, but it was whole. And whole was everything he had ever wanted to be. On a warm afternoon, Ethan made a silent decision. He wrote a letter, not to Olivia, nor to himself, but to the future. He kept it in a simple, unaddressed envelope and placed it in a drawer alongside other records of the new life he was building. In the letter, he wrote what perhaps no other gesture could express, that forgiving often meant accepting not receiving a complete apology, understanding that not everything needs to come back for one to move on, and that truly loving also means having the courage to walk away when the other's love ceases to be a home and becomes a burden. The gesture wasn't symbolic. It was liberating. It was the final point without fanfare, but with all the impact of someone who knows exactly who they are, what they want, and what they will never accept again. On the other side of life, Olivia followed a quieter, more solitary path. The exhibition she put together didn't attract a large audience, it wasn't a critical success, but it left its mark. Some people wrote anonymous notes and left them in the gallery's comments section. One read, "You made me see what I'm doing to those who love me. Thank you." That was enough for her to understand that, even in the midst of pain, there was still something to be built. Not a new love, not yet. But a new way of being in the world. She began dedicating part of her time to writing about human relationships, about unconscious choices, about the weight of absence in relationships. She was invited to a small event on behavior and spoke, with raw honesty, about how easy it is to romanticize freedom when one is running away from one's own emotional responsibility. People listened attentively, but also with discomfort, because she spoke without embellishment. She said, bluntly, that she destroyed something she only knew how to value when it no longer fit in the present. The apartment where she lived now was smaller, but filled with books, paintings, and reflections hanging on the walls. She had learned to be self-sufficient, but the silence of the nights remained her greatest mirror. There was no longer acute pain, but a kind of chronic longing, not for Ethan, exactly, but for the woman she could have been by his side if she had chosen to care instead of neglect. Sometimes she would pass couples on the street and find herself imagining what their Sundays would be like. She also imagined what it would be like if she had matured sooner, if she had said, "I'm sorry," at the right time, and not just after being left behind. But she knew that thoughts like these only serve to rehearse a version of life that will never be enacted. And this, over time, she learned to accept. One morning, Olivia received an envelope with no return address. Inside was a newspaper clipping with an article about a financial education project for women led by Ethan. He didn't include his name, but a photo showed him smiling alongside a team of volunteers. It wasn't provocation. It was just life moving on. And for the first time, she didn't cry. She simply closed her eyes for a moment and whispered to herself, "I'm so glad he found himself." It wasn't resignation. It was maturity. Their story was no longer a mistake to be fixed, but a lesson that, even though painful, transformed her into a more conscious person. The reunion between the two, as inevitable as certain twists and turns of the world, happened by chance, in an airport bookstore. They were both connecting, heading to different destinations, different lives. When their eyes met, time didn't stop. Neither of them felt small. They simply walked toward each other with the respect of those sharing an important chapter. Ethan was the first to smile. Olivia returned the gesture naturally. They talked for a few minutes, without past, without tension, just about the books in their hands and the places they were going. When Ethan's flight was called, he said, "It was good to see you." And she replied, "It was good to see you're okay." They exchanged one last look, and then parted. No promises. No exchange of contact. Just the certainty that they had survived, and that, somehow, they were better off than when everything fell apart. And so, without grand speeches, the story ended. Not with forced reconciliations, nor with revenge disguised as justice. But with real endings. Ethan built peace. Olivia searched for meaning. Neither emerged unscathed, but both emerged transformed. Because, in the end, the greatest consequence of betrayal isn't the loss of the other. It's the loss of oneself the moment one chooses to hurt someone who never hurt us. It's this weight that we carry silently, even after the other has gone. And as much as time lessens the pain, it never erases what was destroyed by choice. If you've come this far with a heavy heart or a conflicted mind, leave your thoughts on this story in the comments. Share your opinion, your reading, and your feelings. And if you're not yet subscribed to the channel, subscribe now. Every week, we'll share real-life stories or inspirations from life, with profound lessons about love, loyalty, and the consequences of human choices. This story is a reminder that betrayal doesn't just destroy relationships. It destroys what's most valuable: trust, admiration, the untouched memory of a love that could have been forever. A betrayal can last minutes, but its consequences last years. Here, on this channel, we make it clear, we do not support any kind of betrayal. Our goal is to show, with respect and depth, the real impact of bad choices. And to remind everyone that loyalty is, even today, one of the purest forms of love.